Hello, welcome to Countercurrents. Today, we're chatting with my good friend, Alastair Crooke, discussing the first week of Trump's presidency and the implications for the world. Is peace on the horizon or not? Thanks for watching, and please take time to share with your friends, like, and subscribe if you would. So let's start with Donald Trump. Yeah, you're just out with the new article, the title of which is Trump positioning himself to be for a no deal. Let me get the exact title here. Is Trump positioning for a no deal with Russia or not? So let's dive in.
Let me just say that. Let's just say that for people who are listening, you can read it too. On Conflicts Forum Substack.
Yeah,
it'll be out there any moment.
We'll I'll put the link up.
Yeah.
So, all right. So go ahead and let's summarize what your article's about.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think it was quite striking what Trump was saying. It was in a sort of impromptu press conference in the Oval Office after the inauguration.
Right. This was the Monday night. So
yeah,
right.
The Monday night, and it was done in an informal way. He seemed to be signing executive orders and answering the odd question here and there. And so he started off. He was asked, well, what happens if you are unable to get a ceasefire from Putin, if you're unable to agree a ceasefire with Putin? And Trump said, well, I think it's really important that he understands. I mean, they've had 1 million dead. The Ukrainians, 700,000, but the Russians have lost 1 million dead.
Right.
And the economy is collapsing. I mean, he's destroying his country. He must take it. I'm doing him a big favor by saying, this is the way out. You need to do a deal, and you need to do a deal quickly. And that's what you need to do. And then later on, though, he said something that was, the opposite, because effectively he was saying, Putin, you're a loser. I mean, you've lost 1 million men. Your economy is collapsing. The country is being destroyed. You're a loser. And then he goes on with another little throwaway aside. After that, he says, of course, Russia is a big, big machine. And ultimately, things may change. I mean, in fact, basically, if you read between the lines of that last sentence, he's saying, well, actually, you may win. Not a loser, but a winner. In this.
Right.
So one question that comes up immediately for me when I listened to this and went through it, one question that came up very clearly from this is, why is Trump actually disrespecting Putin and disrespecting the Russian people? Because they're really quite furious with what was said, because they haven't lost anything. Their casualties are probably, the deaths are probably, don't reach up to 100,000 in Russian deaths. The casualties on the Ukrainian side are far more. The economy is humming, and the country is far from disintegrating at all. So why has he been so determined to call the Russians and Putin specifically losers? And so it prompted me really to ask the question, especially when he sort of says, well, actually, Russia's so much bigger, it's really going to things will change because they're bigger. Is he the one, although he's projecting it and said in that press conference, it's really up to Putin. I don't really know that he wants a deal. So we have to wait and see, does Putin really want a deal? And I thought, well, actually, it sounds more like you don't want the deal rather than Putin doesn't want the deal. Putin has said endless times, listen, I'm open to talk with you. I'm happy to talk. We can talk about Ukraine. Anytime he said it repeatedly, he's not refusing talks with.
Well, in fact, he made
Trump.
that point came up in his the Zoom call that Xi Jinping and Putin had about 5 hours after that Oval Office press conference. They made that exact point.
Exactly. So it sort of raised the question: I mean, what is going on here, and why is Trump? And in the paper I wrote yesterday, I was comparing it. You know, if you want to negotiate, I mean, look at what happened with John Kennedy all those years ago, 53 years ago, at the height of the Cold War, when the Cold War was sort of frozen solid, and in the aftermath of the Cuba crisis. And he got up and he made a speech at that time, and he said, you know, I just want to say, congratulations, the Russians, you've been at the forefront of science, forefront of medicine, forefront of many things technological in this period. And we recall how much you lost during the war. I can't remember the number he gave, but he said something like 27 million people were killed in this war, and we sympathize with your losses. Now, this wasn't just high rhetoric, because what happened from that was a change. And if you like, the arms treaties came into existence because of that initiative that John Kennedy took. But he did it by being respectful and by saying things. I mean, the Russians take these things, you know, they don't take them sort of literally that there was a love affair by John Kennedy with Russia. But I mean, the respect was so important. So why did Trump sort of go to the opposite, and does he not want to deal? And so then I came really to sort of the point that Steve Bannon had brought up. He did a Zoom call with Alex Craner not so long ago, and who was on it and listened. So it was a direct call between Alex Craner and Bannon. And Bannon was very specific, and he said, "Listen, you know, I'm telling Trump, cut it, get out of it now, stop the Ukraine thing, finish it now, because otherwise," he says, "you're going to be like Nixon in the Vietnam War, because in the wake of Nixon's involvement, being pulled into the Vietnam War, he ended up owning it, and he ended up owning the failure. And it wasn't Lyndon Johnson that paid the price. It was Nixon who paid the price, because he kept, instead of having a clean break and getting out." And so Bannon said, you know, I'm telling him, you need to do a clean break now. Yeah. And he said, but the problem is there are a lot of people, including my friend Kellogg and others, who are saying, no. What we need to do is we need more sort of leverage. There's got to be a balance of power on both sides. And this is the only way forward, by increasing the leverage so that we can get a suitable compromise. But the only problem with this, and this is what I've been trying to outline too, is there's a very different view in Russia. The Russians are deeply skeptical about what's happening in Washington because of their long experience. And they say, listen, it's just, you know, new wine in an old bottle. They're just going along. The Americans, it's the same old thing. They want to weaken Russia. It has been in their DNA for so long that they can't change. And, you know, this language that we hear, I mean, is exactly that. And Patrushev, the head of who's the advisor to Putin on security and a member of the National Security Council, said, you know, the only difference now is they're using this in order really, they're going to manufacture artificially the conflict with China. And they want to use Russia to exacerbate this conflict with China and to split the two of us apart. And hence, you mentioned the telephone call. And so the telephone call was precisely that. I think the 90-minute call was between the two leaders comparing notes. Xi briefed Putin on his telephone call with Trump. And they were preparing and saying and sending a clear message back to Washington. Don't think you can divide us. We are going to remain absolutely solidly linked together. So don't even think about it. If this is what you're doing by using this sort of language and trying to, foment tensions between us, you really you can forget about it. And he went on, and Patrushev, in an article that he written, it's only in Russian, but he went on to say, the problem is, and this gets to the root of it. He says, our terms for a solution are not acceptable to Washington. Mm-hmm. They're not acceptable to Washington because it would mean a defeat for NATO. It would be seen as a defeat. And so, inevitably what's going to happen is they are going to sanction us, and it is likely to escalate. And at the same time, don't think we've forgotten about Ukraine. And he mentioned specifically Odessa and Zaporizhia, and he said, those are our pro-Russian territories. In a year, there will not be a Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, we've got definitive proof this week that Trump is saying these things now because that's what the CIA is telling him. And he specifically, when he used the specific number of 700,000 dead, basically.
He started off at 1 million in the first call.
Yeah, but that
someone brought him down.
But that specific number 700,000 appears in an article by David Ignatius of the Washington Post, and Ignatius is known widely here as a stenographer for the CIA. CIA wants something out, they talk to him, and he does this puff piece on Bill Burns, the courageous Bill Burns, leading the fight. And in there, Burns tells him that this is the CIA number of the 700,000. So I went, okay, I was speculating. It was my belief that's where Trump was getting this. Now we know for sure. I'm going to make a run. I don't know how successful it would be, but trying to get information to Trump to realize he's being lied to. Because what do you think will be the result of he goes in with this position? He's going to get shut down by Putin, and or Putin will say, "Look, what you're saying to me is completely wrong, and let me correct the record here." Yeah. If at what point, if Trump does come to realize that he's being lied to, do you think that'll shift the dynamics, or has he already done damage that's beyond repair?
I think that, even if he gets the figures right for the deaths, and those are grossly exaggerated, both of them that he's suggesting, it's much less. The ratios at least 8-1 in terms of death. Maybe we don't know exactly, but even if he gets that right, or what I was trying to quote and say in Russia is the settled belief, that they cannot accept the terms that Russia is saying, we will not allow a frozen conflict by which the West then comes in, rearms, and our war starts again, but from a less advantageous position as far as Russia is concerned. We just are not going to do that. So they're not going to accept our terms, even if they, come and say we're going to have we would like a frozen conflict. We will say no, and then we will see what happens. But we expect that this will not work out so well. But that's inevitable as things stand. Can Trump sort of reorientate? I think he's capable of it. He's come in and he said some really important things that, about that he's a peacemaker, doesn't want to start wars. He wants to end wars. He doesn't want to have wars. He certainly said he doesn't want, to be pushed towards a World War III. So, I mean, I think his intentions of not entering into a conflict with Russia are clear. But at the same time, and this is where Bannon's point was so key, was that, actually the fight, and he said this specifically, it's not about a struggle with China, Russia, and Iran. It's a struggle inside the United States.
Yes.
It's a struggle against them, the domestic enemy, who are going to do everything to undermine us. So I think, I think there is a chance, and certainly if, Bannon's view somehow prevails. I mean, who knows, within the maelstrom, which is, the Beltway, Washington Beltway, within that. But it is worrying. I mean, I know Tulsi Gabbard hasn't been appointed yet, hasn't been approved by the Senate yet, but he does need someone who's...
They're not even going to have the hearing until next week at the earliest. They're slow rolling her as much as they can.
Yeah.
So, I mean, let me make one other point that the CIA is working really in overdrive right now with this disinformation campaign, because it's not just giving Trump the wrong numbers about casualties and the state of the Russian economy, that's in tatters, to use Ursula von der Leyen's ill-conceived phrase. But, their articles are popping up. Even in foreign affairs, we're trying to downplay the hopes that an economic collapse in Russia was on the horizon. It still was laced with just false information, just a complete misunderstanding of what's taking place in Russia, and so this weight of this information campaign to portray Russia still as weak and on the ropes is I view that as a very desperate move by the intelligence community, because they realize the gig's up. This thing's coming crashing down.
Yeah, I think it is an act of desperation. And, you're right in focusing on the CIA and that circle. But equally, the Europeans have been pushing this very hard because they're on the hook for so much Ukraine debt. I mean, Britain has about, I think, billions and billions, 20 billions in Ukrainian bonds, and has given guarantees to the IMF. And the economic circumstances of many European states is extremely fragile at the moment. So they're desperately worried about what happens if all of these debts that they have suddenly get called in by the IMF or by bondholders. So, they're getting support from there. They want it. I mean, fortunately, I don't think there's anyone in Washington who wants to pay any attention to the Europeans at the moment. They don't. They quite rightly decided to write them off this process. So they're sort of, dancing around in Davos, or have been these last days, trying to sort of gin up a bit of a courage and face a world that's changing so dramatically.
This gets us a little off topic, but is Starmer a moron? I mean, Keir Starmer, his idea to send Labor Party workers to campaign for Kamala Harris.
He is stupid. I mean, he's not bright at all. He's very stupid. And he's making all these mistakes, such egregious mistakes that I'm not sure he'll remain in office. I mean, there is this rape gangs crisis, and now we have another one in Southport where 3 young girls were stabbed. We're not allowed to know the details because there's a cover-up. And so now they've made sure that he will plead guilty so that there's no trial, no evidence being produced. And there's outrage that, again, there's a cover-up. Starmer was the director of public prosecutions during this, the rape gang episode. I mean, and 100,000, I had no idea that it was so terrible until I read some of the proceedings and what had been done to these young girls, so 6 and 7 and 11. It's just awful.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure he'll survive all this. I'm not sure. But it'll bring down also, incidentally, because this is a sort of bigger thing, because, because Musk raised this and brought it up and put it in the headlines, but it's bringing down a lot of that whole superstructure of, misinformation by the government, of lying, or cover up, of concealing it. The whole information structure that you have in the United States with the platforms and things is slowly being reversed by Musk. And that's really very important. I mean, it's changing. It's beginning to sort of percolate across Europe and have its effect. Likewise with his interview of Alice Weidel, the head of the AfD in Germany. So these things, this whole imaginary narratives, the whole construct of memes that was suitable to both the Biden administration and to the Brussels administration, if you can call it that. I mean, all of this is sort of slowly unraveling, along with, the COVID story and the gang rape story and all these things. There's a big unmasking going on. And I think this is going to be one of the major changes in why, Trump does have a prospect of bringing about fundamental change, because there is something taking place which is palpable within both American society, and now slower and less so because believe it or not, our press media system is even more controlled than Americans one was. So it is, people just don't believe the elites anymore. That whole story has collapsed.
Well, in fact, one of the interesting things that the media has not paid much attention to, and in Trump's executive orders, one of those executive orders called an immediate halt to all foreign aid for 90 days.
That's right.
Last I checked, Ukraine is getting foreign aid. So there's been the shutdown in the movement of foreign aid to Ukraine. You've had the personnel at the Department of Defense who were in charge of managing the flow of all material assistance to Ukraine, that they've been removed. They've been told to go home, that they're no longer on the job. And then those staffers at the National Security Council, who a lot of them are seconded from CIA or Defense Intelligence Agency to the National Security Council to work on issues, specifically Russia, Iran, they've been sent back to their agencies. So you've brought this whole the guts, if you will, of the policy-making process have been dismantled for temporarily, at least. So whether or not Trump is going to pull the plug on Ukraine, I would argue that the plug has actually been pulled right now. It's just is not. It hasn't been done in a public way.
Well, I think that's. This is very important. But I think we should always remember, and I keep trying to remind people, the Trump is just one person. I mean, it's been. It is remarkable how he has single-handedly upended a master narrative that has been existing for a long time. He's upended a master narrative with help from Elon Musk and with others. But, you know, I think what Steve Bannon was saying was so important, and I keep emphasizing it too. You know, he can't sort everything out. You know,
Right.
the Middle East, Iran, Russia, China, because his main problem was to stop the uncontrolled expenditure of federal funds, to get some sort of balance back in the budgeting, and to end, you know, the censorship and the if you like, the cultural war
Right.
that has been waged against both Americans and Europeans, with, you know, the gender balance and the gender wars, identity politics. To get those done is, you know, and it'll be done against huge counter pressure. People who will try and obstruct it, who will try and lay traps and problems on the way. So it's going to be, it really is going to be very, very difficult, I think, period, for him to, you know, to do all that. So we have to realize that, and I think that's what Bannon was saying, you know, focus on the main thing. So, you know, how much time he can spend, how much he will be able to, you know, the Middle East is known to be a sort of blotting paper absorbing sort of
Right.
political capital and political attention and other things. So, you know, I don't always expect that much to come from it, but we have to wait and see.
Well, that, and maybe we can transition for a bit. You know, we're talking about Trump and his policies, but what he did with respect to pushing the ceasefire to the front, getting that in place, because when you look at him on paper, he's taken money from Miriam Adelson, the widow of Sheldon Adelson, this you know, billionaire Zionist. He has staffed his national security team with a group of Christian Zionists. So he doesn't have people like Blinken, who's by virtue of his ethnic heritage as a Jew, and as a Jew with Ukrainian heritage, was inclined to be very much supportive of Israel. You get the likes of a Mike Huckabee or a Marco Rubio or Michael Waltz, but nonetheless, the rhetoric is very much pro-Israel. And yet, you know, he puts out that Jeffrey Sachs clip from the Oxford Union where Sachs was just excoriating Biden. I mean, he was going after Netanyahu to call him a deep, dark son of a bitch was remarkable. And then to send Steve Witkoff, who again is Jewish, is considered a Zionist, but doesn't kowtow at all to Netanyahu. Basically, you know, it tells that, hey, you're going to meet with me. I don't care if it's Shabbat or not. So, what's your take on this?
I think, I mean, there was one thing that was quite clear after that process. Witkoff did two videos. I think it was from the arena, the meeting that took place in the Washington arena. And he made some statements, and they were strikingly lucid, clear, and quite sharp. And he said, you know, this is the end of free lunches. He said, no more blank checks. I expect reciprocity. I am empowered by the president, and I'm totally focused. We are not interested in symbolic actions. We want actionable outcomes. We want to see real outcomes, and we expect people to reciprocate. Don't think it's just us. We expect reciprocity from it. And we pursue, and he said things which were quite surprising. We support sovereignty and the freedom for states to pursue their own destiny. Well, this sounds more like a BRIC statement in some respects. Right. I mean, it was great. I mean, or going back even to the non-aligned movement. not something we associate so much because the previous rhetoric has been all about, you've got to adhere to the Washington consensus and, all of this. And so it was quite striking. And Trump was there in the background and sort of pointing and saying, yes, this is right. Reciprocity and no free. And Witkoff said, this is going to be era of hard talking, hard conversations, and bold actions. And we expect that from our partners and interlocutors. Now, is this going to come to pass? Well, it was very, very clear. And I must say, Witkoff said it without any sort of flourishes or without any sort of dressings. He was reading it very carefully off a teleprompter. And it was very precise and very clear. So I think that, within the bigger picture, that Trump is looking to bring about a sort of cultural revolution in foreign policy. But of course, when you said about all the Israeli firsters, I mean, this is the entry price that you have to pay to even enter into the discussion with the deep state about which of your nominees are going to get Senate approval. You have to pay an entry price. I remember when I was living in Israel at that time, I wrote an article about the Oslo process. And the American ambassador called me and he said, it's a great article. I like it a lot, but there's one thing wrong with it, Alastair. And I said, oh, what is that? And he said, you don't say that Arafat was offered everything and turned his back and took up the gun on us. And if you don't say that, then no one will read the article. In other words, pay the entry price and we'll read the article. Yeah. If you don't put the entry price, forget it. Yeah. And it's the same. I think, he needs to get, Kash Patel and Gabbard and others, nominate the key people through the Senate. But they're going to demand some sort of reciprocity. It's not free. And we don't know how that debate is going, how much he's getting. It seems he's getting a few through, but it's a big battle. And I suspect the deep state are saying, okay, you want the FBI slot? Okay. But, there are deep structures of foreign policy. We're not going to give those up. And one of them, of course, is Israel. And one of them, of course, is Russia. I mean, these have been the structures of American foreign policy since the 70s, deeply, deeply ingrained, uniparty, bipartisan acceptance until 2016 when Trump arrived on the scene. Yeah. So I think, before he can really move in many of these areas, he's got to finish that deal first, the internal deal about getting these people, his key people, through Senate approval.
Well, I was just going to say the contrast between Trump 2017, when he first came into office, and now it's really night and day. It is Trump in 2017 was entirely unprepared, and coupled with his arrogance to think that he knew, he thought he could charm his way through Washington, D.C., and he got run over. It was like the guy, the protester in Tiananmen Square standing in front of a tank, but instead of the tank not running him over, the Washington ran Trump over. He didn't have. He barely had his cabinet put together when he took the oath of office in 2017. He didn't have any of the second, third, and fourth tier level officials lined up and ready to go. And really, I don't think had any kind of strategic plan. This time, boy, they hit the ground running. And we would like it or not, with all those executive orders he signed, the good, the bad, I called it the good, the bad, and the ugly. Uh, it's really sort of set Washington on its ear. The establishment, they're reeling right now. They don't know what to do, and
European establishment too.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've been watching all these people who have been, attacking Trump are now showing up with these, with bottles of wine and boxes of candy and flowers, trying to court Trump. I don't think it's going to work, but and that brings me to a question about Europe in general. The way the discussion is handled, it talks about Europe as if it's got some real political power, and that the countries in the UK, France, and Germany in particular, that these are still government, that there's a political movement in those countries that has power, has control. Yeah, I'm looking at it, they're split. Labor, even between the Labor and Tory parties, they're not majority parties anymore. They're minority parties. And that's what strikes me, is that it seems what were considered the critical countries in Europe are lacking any sort of political consensus whatsoever, that is deeply divided. Am I off base on that?
No, you're right, but it's a lot worse than you describe it. That's all. It's in the sense that the main countries in Europe. I mean, I'm talking about old Europe, not the new Europe, if you like, of the East European states. But the key countries are in deep crisis. Britain is courting bankruptcy, literally. Very close. It has great problems with its debt problems. Mm-hmm. France has the same. Germany has this huge debt problem too. I mean, that's why we're having elections in Germany, because of the debt problem. Italy has the same problems. Brussels itself has this problem. And yes, there is a huge, the questions that people are not really liking to even ask in public, about, policy and the failures. I mean, Britain is sending 3 billion pounds to I think it is 3 billion or something per annum to Ukraine in support for it. At the same time, it's cutting old age pensioners' heating allowances in this freezing weather, so they are not able to afford the heating. They're cutting services, health, all these things. And the German, Green minister says, well, you have to do this. And the Brussels says, why, you should be prepared to give up your social services for defense. Stop worrying about, health services, schooling, transport, and things like this. The money's all got to go into defense. And of course, there's no appetite for this. Deeply, deeply divided over this. And they're just trying to keep going by doubling down, and also by what we call the Cordon Sanitaire. Mm-hmm. The Cordon Sanitaire is a way of keeping what they call the far right, which isn't far right at all. It is probably conservative and libertarian, if anything, but not far right. Maybe bits of it have been more right than others, but it's a misnomer. And this is breaking Europe and dividing it. And Europe is on the brink of not really being able to function. It has no political capacity. The economic prospects are grim. It is overregulated. I mean, its own Minister Draghi, who was the famous ECB head, who said, we'll do everything to support the euro, says, it's on a crisis to crash, because we're uncompetitive, and is now stuck very much between a rock and a hard place. It's lost its cheap energy supplies. We're paying 3 or 4 times more for energy than when it was provided by Russia. Businesses are no longer competitive. Some are going to the United States. And at the same time that they are losing, not becoming competitive, it's falling behind. It's so overregulated that there's so little innovation. There's nothing new coming. You know, the sort of the main industries, like in Germany, the car industry, which 10 years ago was, you know, an important, valued industry.
Yeah.
And then, but now move on 10 years and look at a Mercedes-Benz. I think you'll think, you know, nothing much has changed from 10 years ago. It looks the same car. It might have a slightly different sort of glitz on it, but otherwise it hasn't evolved. There's no sort of technological innovation. But the Chinese are doing that. The Chinese are changing things very rapidly, and Europe is stuck in this rut of over-regulation and bureaucracy, and if you like, the inheritance from the Biden administration, because it was just a sort of outgrowth of the Biden administration, Brussels, and the world. It goes back, of course, to the 1970s and that period when Brzezinski was writing his book about the new technical world, and Rockefeller and others were, and we had then the Bilderberg and Davos all emerging out of that period. But we're still in it, and I think it's going to go on until we are forcefully expelled from that view.
Well, in fact, that's the automobile facet of this with China is something that most in the West have not even grasped the change that's taken place. Ford and Chevy, as an example, used to, I think their sales in China over the last 10 years have dropped 40%. So China used to be sort of a profit center for American automobile manufacturers. In my own consulting firm, we actually had a contract with one of the German luxury automobile makers because they were being victimized by what was called straw purchasing of automobiles. And what this was the Chinese, the Russian mob did it a little bit too, but there's primarily the Chinese were hiring retired people, college students, to go to dealerships and buy or lease one of these luxury vehicles. And then they'd come out, and then the student, the person who was doing the straw purchase, they'd get anywhere from $500 to $1,000. Those cars were then loaded up in 40-foot containers, shipped to China. In fact, the brother of the trade minister of China owned one of the car lots that these vehicles were being sold at. It was this German luxury automobile maker was losing when we started $800 million a year. So it was a very lucrative business on the one hand, and costly for the German automobile manufacturer. Well, that contract's gone away. In part, it's gone away because now China's producing its own cars. And, you and I saw that when we were in Moscow, that, there's some Mercedes and Audis and BMWs running around, but these Chinese vehicles are proliferating.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. So Europe, is in, the cost of living goes up enormously. Businesses are closing because they can't afford the increased price of electricity and diesel and other things. Companies are shutting, and they're all up against a debt crisis. they are facing a real crisis, fiscal crisis, in the revenues they have are not enough to, if you like, finance those countries, finance them in the way in which they've been accustomed or have, been forced to, live in this way because, they're expensive and are deliberately made expensive. And you have to live this way, otherwise you fall through the floor and into sort of homelessness or something like that. So it's a serious problem, and we have an immigration problem too, as well. So Europe is in a bad way. In one sense, someone made a very interesting comment, and he was talking about American policy now, Trump policy, and he said, "Well, America's always been expansionist. It has to expand more and more, like a sort of Ponzi scheme. There has to be new territories taken, and it's got to be. This is deeply sort of ingrained in America." And he said, "But actually, it's come to an end. It's stopped. So what is America doing? It's actually recolonizing the colonized.
Yeah.
Greenland and Canada and Europe
Panama
is big, and Panama."
Yeah.
The US is now sort of fallen back from expanding into virgin territories to recolonizing the existing colonies in a new way. And I thought it was quite an interesting comment about how it is. And, Britain is part of the process of recolonization that has been going on, certainly through the Biden years.
Well, I want to get your thoughts as well on the effects on U.S. policy of this agreement, strategic security agreement, that Russia and Iran signed last Friday. So, basically 3 days prior to Trump's inauguration, this had been postponed. There was some thought that it would have taken place at the BRICS summit, and yet Putin, it looks to me like Putin chose to do this prior to Trump, immediately prior to Trump's inauguration, in order to send a very clear message. Am I reading too much into that?
No, you're not. But it needs to be sort of refined a little bit, I think, because, it wasn't a defense treaty, as in the, North Korea. Neither is obligated to come to the actual defense of the other, but they are obligated not to contribute, if you like, to an attack on the other. They are precluded from, contributing or adding to some action taken against the other party. But what it did do, and what was more important in the way, because of, we can read the map of where things are going, is it laid out much more clearly a sort of roadmap about living with sanctions and about how the BRICS and how Russia and Iran can overcome the expected onslaught of more sanctions. Well, Russia's just had a whole series of sanctions imposed on tankers and others. And so a lot of the agreement was things like gas pipeline between, Russia to Iran. I know that sounds rather strange in the sense that, Iran has one of the biggest gas reserves in the world, but it's all about, markets, Iran serving this market, Russia serving that market in this way. So it is, and how to avoid the sort of the dollar sphere and dollar sanctions. So I think it's a very important opening to the West. And I think I should just make it clear, because I think sometimes, because you hear the West focuses enormously on sort of the former foreign minister Zarif or Pezeshkian, the president, they don't lead foreign policy. It's at all. Under the Iranian constitution, they're responsible for domestic policy and domestic administration. Foreign policy belongs to the Supreme Leader and the Supreme National Security Council, and on which, of course, Pezeshkian sits, but so does the Revolutionary Guards, so does the Intelligence Service,
Right.
everyone like that. And that's where policy is made on the big on the big issues. But Iran is going through a sort of reorientation towards finding its new position economically in the world, and both politically and economically. And therefore, the Supreme Leader made the decision it was important, even if the reformists are smaller than they were under the period of Khatami, that they participated in this process, not were outside it and against it. He wanted them in the tent rather than outside the tent as Iran starts repositioning. So it wasn't a sort of great turn towards sort of negotiating with the West. It's more a sort of confirmation of moving gradually and bringing people with the leadership towards BRICS and Central Asia. So the North-South corridor was a major feature of this agreement,
right.
Big investment going into that and other things like that. So it was more a little bit about that. And, it seems extremely likely from all the talks, not only Russia is now under more sanctions, but Iran will be. But I think that whole structure is transformed to a certain extent because Iranians have before them the example of Syria. The sanctions, the Caesar sanctions and the sanctions on Syria, in the end, absolutely eviscerated the economy completely. There was no economy left. The Americans had taken the oil and given it to the Kurds in the northeast of Syria. The agricultural, the useful Syria on the northeast, which was a sort of breadbasket for the whole region, occupied by the Kurds with American forces protecting it. Yeah. And then what remains of the industrial side of Syria, which was in Idlib and around Aleppo, had been taken mostly by the Turks over these recent years, starting from 2011 onwards. They just dismantled parts of Aleppo industrial system and taken them away. There was nothing, there was not enough even to keep people alive virtually in Syria by the end, by what it came to. So, when people talk glibly and say, oh, well, we're going to put the pressure on Iran, we're going to sanction them more and more and more. Maybe 10 years ago, you'd have got some sort of response that would have been more open. But I think after people have seen, that sanctions equals regime change, period.
Yeah.
They've got it. They understand what this means. And of course, actually, Kellogg said it, spelt it out at that conference in Paris, I think about 2 weeks ago. And he said, there's a window where we can democratize Iran. It's a window, it's an opportunity, and we must do this. We must put kinetic and economic and all other pressures on Iran, and we must add and we must work with the people inside, the Iranians inside, to bring about a new democratic Iran. It was regime change was what he was advocating. And he did it to the MEK, who are a terrorist organization, even in American terms. And who, were in the war against Iran, in the Iraq-Iran war, fought against their own country, and are therefore regarded with great dislike inside Iran. So I think that sort of paradigm is changing. Now, is that understood in Washington? Well, you tell me. I don't know.
Yeah, no, there is. They're missing the signs. I think that security agreement that Russia and Iran entered into was far more profound and had. I think that was one of the reasons. I think the Russians used that agreement as some leverage over Iran to keep Iran from retaliating against Israel. For Israel's October 27th attack was viewed as something that Iran needed to respond to. And I know that Professor Morandi, who I have a lot of respect for, he really believed, man, any day now, Iran's going to retaliate. And they never did. And it appears to me that Russia was giving them good advice behind the scenes, like, keep your powder dry. We're going to have a more formal relationship with you now than we've ever had before. But it's not going to be, on the defense side, we're not going to come out and say we'll go to war for you. But we're saying we will act under Article 51 and under the UN Charter and other international law, that basically, if they are attacked, Russia will assist them. But we've got all these other agreements that are alluded to in national security, intelligence cooperation, military cooperation, that are alluded to in this agreement, but not explicitly laid out. And I think that enticed Iran to say, okay, we'll wait. We're going to wait and see, because they had every right, from my view, to retaliate. What do you think about that perspective?
I think it is one that is quite current in most of the West. And it's extended often, and I've heard people suggest that, Russia was, using this to stop Iran from moving towards a nuclear weapon. As you know, there is quite support for weaponizing. It wouldn't take very much. It wouldn't be difficult for Iran to do it. That hasn't happened. But I would just say, that issue was not even discussed in these agreements, before them or behind them. It was not at all discussed. There was no pressure. And indeed, it would have been hypocritical of Russia, which is itself moving to revise its nuclear doctrine towards the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons in defensive position. As you know, there's a deep argument been going on in Moscow. So it would have been not really appropriate for Russians to say, well, we're moving to, because we can see if there's escalation with the West, sooner or later we're going to have to cope with the prospect of whether we go to nuclear or not, and in what way. And so that discussion, a deep discussion, is going on. So that was not part of it. Now, there is a general agreement been from going far back to try and avoid all-out war in the region, because it's so destructive and so damaging. So that is so. But Iran has been balancing, and this is the difficult balance that it's facing, is that there is a strong view within Iran that the pendulum has swung too much towards diplomacy, particularly with some of the figures I've just mentioned, sort of saying to the West, well, we're open to negotiations, which would end up with regime change type sanctions or deterrence. And I think that actually, in the end, the deterrence faction prevailed overall, that there was. And the previous foreign minister, Abdullahian, who was killed in that helicopter with Raisi, the former president, was very, very keen, I remember, in arguing about the need for a better balance of deterrence. And so there has been a real argument about when and how, in what way to express deterrence, even before Trump's election, that it could take place. Now, I think that what has happened is that there is now the Iranians have agreed on a hiatus, partly because of the effect that the Trump trepidation has had on Israel, and that Israel is at sixes and sevens within itself.
Right.
And that there is a lot of disagreements. It's not clear whether, at the moment the government is holding because only Ben Gvir has left it with 7 seats. With his 6 seats, and Smotrich has 7, but Smotrich hasn't left the government. So I think at the moment, but really there's a big question mark Israel is wondering, what has it achieved? What is it, what was, we've destroyed a lot of houses, homes, people, children, but what's the political, dividend that it has brought us? And you can point to the opposite, lots of, disadvantages that have come, the delegitimization and everything. And it hasn't. It has been an imaginary wars, imaginary victories that Netanyahu has touted. And so Witkoff's arrival and what he did, has shaken Israel. And what has shaken them even more was the sight of, Hamas openly in the streets in Gaza, in weapons and taking control of the convoys, managing the exchange, and that the hostages that came out were smiling and in visibly good health. I mean, they came out looking quite sprightly. So it was had a huge effect in sort of Israelis saying, but we've been told that Hamas had been completely destroyed. And here they are. Look, it was just like the 7th of October. We saw them on the streets just as then. I mean, so what have we done apart from lose a lot of our young men?
Well, they were kitted out. The Hamas fighters that were accompanying the hostages, the 3 women, the 3 Israeli soldiers, that is what they were. I noticed immediately the uniforms. They were new. They were clean. These guys were well put together. They were well put together. And, back when I was at State Department in the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Training Program, and I kept in touch with it after that, one of the things we frequently heard was that we also had training. We did training for the Palestinians, for their security force. And the trainers who interacted both with the Israelis and with the Palestinians always came out very complimentary that the Palestinians were far more professional, far more competent than the Israelis. The Israelis entered with an attitude of arrogance and that we know what we're doing, and they didn't, and we're not teachable. So, as you say, with that image alone right there captured that after 15 months, Israel failed to defeat Hamas.
Yeah. And the hostages, they were expecting them to sort of go straight into hospital.
Yeah.
They wandered around quite normally. So it was quite a shock to many Israelis. And so I think at the moment, what Professor Morandi said to you is not past, not out of the consideration.
Not off the table.
It'll because I just think after Syria and what's happened, the idea of going back, I don't think there's any appetite of going back. In a long negotiation. They said already they won't negotiate with America, only with the Europeans. But that's the same thing. There's no difference.
Yeah.
And they have the ability I mean, it's a pointless exercise. Iran is a threshold state now. It's not yet a weapon state, but all it requires is for fissile material to be loaded into a warhead, and it would be a weapon state.
Yeah.
How long that would take, no one can say precisely, but in my view, not long. And so, both of these options, and what was, I think, really significant is in which, as you rightly said, in that agreement, which was not really specified, were the intelligence undertakings. And I think the most important one was the linking of the Iranian air defenses with the Russian radar systems. The Iranians have got effective air defenses, despite all of the propaganda that you hear everywhere saying it's not, they were all destroyed. They have very good air defenses. Israel knows that, but is trying to play up the opposite because it's trying to create the circumstances in which it can inveigle a Trump who perhaps has been fed the Kool-Aid on, that Iran is sort of on the brink and just one push and it would collapse. And then there could be, the people will throw out the Ayatollahs and take over the country. I mean, it's just nonsense, but, but people believe that in Europe and in America. They believe that, it's on the verge of collapsing. Its economy isn't as good as Russia's by far, but they don't want to go down the road of more sanctions and more pressures and things like that. And this is really the problem facing America: is what has it got to offer Iran?
Yeah.
I mean, what are you going to offer it that would make sense not just to the Iranian leadership, but to ordinary Iranians? I mean, other than to say, why don't you just get on with life? And if you want to use nuclear energy, use it. And, let's open trade and start. But no. And so I think we will probably go down something of there will be sanctions and others put on because we can't get out of this rut of doing the same. Even, like Pavlov's dogs, we go on doing the same. Even when it fails and fails again, we're just Pavlovian.
Doing Einstein's definition of insanity, or at least it is attributed to Einstein. It may be apocryphal, but doing the same thing over and over, expecting a
different result,
different outcome. So, hey, my friend,
they will get a different result.
Yeah. So I've kept you for well over an hour. I appreciate your time. I always want to sit down and what I have to do is come to Italy and sit down with you and your good wife, and we'll be able to chat in person and maybe solve the world's problems.
That would be ideal, either there or in Moscow. Who knows?
All right. Hey, listen, thanks. Let me go ahead and I'll stop the recording here. As always, Alastair delivers. It's always a pleasure. We could sit and chat for a much longer period of time, preferably over a beer or a coffee. Thanks for watching. Hit the like button. Hopefully you subscribe to this channel. Try to post one video a week, not overwhelm you, but we try to deal with relevant issues and have people like Alastair who bring a wealth of experience to the table. Thanks for watching. I'm Larry Johnson. This is Countercurrents.